Okay, where's slideshow? It says we're still sharing, so I guess we're good. All right. Part of circuit components, we're going to talk about filters. Basically pi and T filters in this one. And a little bit about digital filtering, which I'm learning more about, but it's still a challenge. So basically you have two types of high-pass filters that are used in output stages, a T or a pi, because they look like a T or a pi. In the case of the high pass, it passes frequencies above the cutoff frequency and blocks frequencies below the cutoff frequency. The formulas are there to calculate the cutoff frequency and characteristic impedance and inductance, capacitance, but you don't need to know those for the test. But Rick, you can write them down just so you have them. And the reason, if you notice in the cutoff frequency, you got 4 pi in there because the way they're showing the circuit is 2C as opposed to just C. So that's why it changes the formula a little bit. Okay, so for a T, okay, if it's a high pass, you notice that we have the capacitors in series, the inductor in a shunt configuration. So the higher the frequency, the lower the reactance on the capacitors or their effective resistance, the higher the reactance on the inductor when we increase frequency. So that's basically a voltage divider network. So the higher the frequency, the energy is higher, the voltage, the tap point essentially, because you're going at a certain frequency or high enough frequency that input capacitor is going to look like a short circuit or zero resistance.
We saw when you increase frequency, the capacitor reactance increases.
No. You left too early last week.
I left at 1 o'clock. I mean, how early could I have left? What time did you guys knock off last week?
No, not too much longer than that. Capacity reactance decreases with frequency. Remember, it's 1 over 2 pi
okay.
C.
Okay.
So the higher the frequency, okay, the lower the result, right?
I didn't have any time to study this week.
That's all right. So as the frequency increases, okay, it's going to pass more of the signal.
50 years ago, I knew this stuff in my sleep. I mean,
I knew a lot of things 50 years ago too. So which of the following is a property of a T network with a series capacitor and parallel shunt inductor?
it's a high pass filter.
Okay. So what's the so now we have low pass, same configurations, T's and Pi's, and all we did is swap capacitors and inductors. Okay. Because inductors increase their reactance with frequency. So if the inductor is in series, it's going to, the higher the frequency, the more it's going to block the signal. And you got all the same thing. You also have a cutoff frequency. So it's going to pass signals below the cutoff and block signals above the cutoff. And the cutoff is the 3 dB down point, or 0.707. So we call this a pi network because it looks like the pi symbol. In the case of making it a low pass, we've got shunt capacitors and a series inductor, as opposed to shunt inductors and a series capacitor for our high pass. So how are the capacitors and inductors of a low pass pi arranged?
Many.
Yeah. I didn't write the question.
Over.
Yeah, this is one you definitely have to read.
Yes, it makes sense. Two capacitors.
You say Bravo or Delta?
Delta.
Delta?
No, it's Delta.
So when it's capacitive, when it's capacitors in series, it's a low pass?
When it's capacitive in series, it's a high pass.
Yeah.
Because capacitors pass high frequencies. Inductors pass low frequencies.
So that's what makes the pi shape, is capacitors on the upward and downward legs, and then the.
Yeah, yes.
So we've got a capacitor between input and ground on each end and an inductor in series. Now you can use these as matching networks, which is one of the reasons why they were showing the pi networks as an output filter on your power amplifier, for instance, because you can use it as a matching network. The advantage of the pi is you can control the Q of the circuit. And if you go online, you can find calculators for a pi matching network, and one of the things you plug in is what Q you want. So you want a Q of 3 or 4, and then some other things, and it will calculate the parameters to give you the impedance match, okay, for whatever this, assuming you know what the impedance is you're trying to match. I mean, you have to know the reactance and the resistance of the load. And all it does is calculate the conjugate of it.
It shifts it back to non-reactive.
Right. And magically it can change the resistance. So if you've got an antenna that say was 72 ohms resistive and 35 ohms inductive, then this would not only get rid of the inductive reactance, but it would change the resistance to look like 50 ohms. I don't totally understand how that works, but I know how to do it on a Smith chart. So that's one of the advantages of using the pi as opposed to just a straight L network, because you can control the Q or the bandwidth of that matching filter. So how does an impedance matching circuit transform a complex impedance to a resistive impedance? See,
Yeah, see,
Right.
you just explained.
it cancels the reactance and magically changes the resistance.
Magically.
Magically. A lot of stuff in this is magic. That's what they used to say if you traveled in time, and went back.
Well,
Yeah, people, you could do things that people would think were magic. What is one advantage of a pi matching network over an L matching network?
You said the Q.
the Q. That's the big advantage. Because you can do a matching network as an L, but you can't control the Q. Now, but you can take a pi and add an L on the end, which means essentially adding a series inductor. And what that will do is get rid of some of the additional harmonics. And that's the basic reason you would do it, particularly for vacuum tube amplifiers. So which describes a pi-L network used for matching a vacuum tube final to a 50 ohm unbalanced output?
Additional series on the output.
What advantage does a series L pi-L network have over a series L pi network for impedance matching on the final vacuum tube transmitter? What did the inductor do?
Harmonic suppression.
Right. Kind of like putting the ferrite bead, which is adding an inductor. Okay, crystal filters. Sometimes they call them crystal lattice. Sometimes they refer to it as a crystal ladder. As far as I can tell, is one and the same. There's no real difference. And you make one by using some 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 piezo crystals that have very narrow bandwidth, and you select the frequencies of them to get the shape factor of the filter, the pass band. These are used for normally for a bandpass type filter. And you can get a, like they show over here, you can get a fairly narrow band with steep skirt filter. You'll have some ripple on the top. So they're actually, they were used a lot as narrow band bandpass filters. I don't know if they use them as much today because you can do the same thing in an SDR radio digitally.
Wouldn't that have been used like, with two amps and?
Oh yeah, I remember, and you used to be able to buy them crystal bandpass filters as a plug-in.
Oh, sure, $500.
And yeah, they probably weren't cheap.
No, no.
I never bought one, but I saw them advertised. So the shape factor is the ability to reject the adjacent signals. In other words, how steep the skirts are. So that determines how close you can be to another signal and still reject it.
It would be like a great CW filter.
Yeah,
That's what they were sold for.
yeah. And the closer the frequencies are, I mean, the narrower the band.
Right.
And that's like the way you would tune an old IF strip, with the transformers,
Yeah.
and you staggered them. Okay, so that's how you controlled the bandwidth of that filter, because you tune the two of them slightly different in order to
Right, to control the gap.
right. And of course, the closer you got them, then the more peaked it would be, and the farther apart, and you got dip. So it was a compromise. Okay, and typical circuit with 4 of them and the capacitors and inductor in there. So what is a crystal lattice filter? Delta.
Yeah. Huh.
Which of the following factors has the greatest effect on the bandwidth and response shape of a crystal lattice filter?
Greatest effect on frequency with the best.
Right. Which of the following describes a receiving filter's ability to reject signals occupying an adjacent channel? Shape factor. Okay, here's some different analog filters. We got Bessel's, Butterworth's, Chebyshev, and elliptic. Butterworth's used to be very common. In fact, they're probably still used because there's no ripple in the passband for a Butterworth filter, but they don't have as steep as skirts. The Chebyshev has much steeper skirts than the Butterworth or the Bessel, but you get ripple in the passband. And the elliptic filter is the steepest for the same number of stages. But you not only get some ripple in the passband, you get a lot of ripple in the stop band. They don't show that much here, but typically you'll see much higher ripples out there in the passband. So certain frequencies, it won't reject as much as others. So which filter is described as having ripple in the passband and a sharp cutoff?
Chevy.
The chubby one.
Chevy what?
Yeah.
Chevy.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's Chebyshev or Chebyshev.
Chevy Chase.
The Russian one.
Chevy.
What are distinguishing features of an elliptical filter?
Well, I'd say the sharp cutoff, but what do you mean one or more notches in the stop one?
Well, I think they actually
I mean, if it's
refer
sharply
to it.
cutting off, how are you gonna have notches in that? I mean,
I mean, wouldn't it be a ripple in the stop band? They call notches there.
Yeah,
They're
and that's what the other
notches
stuff
because
said, but
they're-
I didn't do the question.
all right, all right, all right.
They call them notches because they're more drastic, right? They're
Yeah.
not little ripples, they're
It's kind of because
big.
when you got a notch where the notch isn't, you've got a ripple. So, it's lower rejection at the
Desired.
points where where there aren't notches. I don't know why they worded it that way. It's the FCC. Don't blame me.
So now Bob's classes now have a disclaimer. Yeah.
Make you a t-shirt. It's the FCC, do not blame me.
It's not my fault. Yeah.
Okay, so in applications, one of the things would be for a 2-meter repeater duplexer. I'm gonna have to go actually see one someday. I've never physically seen one.
What, a cavity filter?
Yeah. But normally that's what you would use for a duplexer on a repeater. Does everybody know what a duplexer is? Where you basically, well, how do we describe a duplexer?
Simultaneous receive and transmit.
Yeah, it doesn't mix or combine two signals,
Right.
but it allows directional
Input on one signal.
sort of like a switch for different frequencies. So one of the reasons you use the cavity filter is because they have very low insertion loss. less than a dB typically. Very high selectivity, 50 to 100. And they can handle a lot of power because they're physically large filters. They're cans
You can't.
with a tuned cavity, capacitor, inductor, and you tune it. Or so they say. And I'm assuming that center cylinder down there that you have the slug that moves in and out is changing the inductance as well as the capacitance.
That's got you, yeah.
And then you couple it with those little in and out things.
Would be in between the repeater transceiver and the antenna.
Yeah.
And every cell phone company in the world should be writing a check to the ARRL every month for coming up with this stuff, 50, 60 years ago.
Oh. Which of the following filters would be the best choice for use in a 2-meter repeater duplexer?
Cabinet.
Okay.
Well, can we take our lunch break now, teacher? I mean, we're gonna be here
Sure.
today, man.
No, I only got one more.
Oh,
Aren't you taking breaks all along?
No,
oh, my eyes were open. Yeah.
like you only got 2 bullet points.
Well, there's more slides than 2, but
Well,
there's 2 subjects.
2 bullet.
Yeah.
Positive.
What did I just hear? One just became 2 suddenly? Is this the new math class?
What do you mean?
One,
I thought we only had one more section to do. Now it's
We
2.
just.
No, one section.
But there's
Yeah.
15
It has-
possible questions in this section.
Could be 27.
No, but
Oh,
there's
there is
15 possible questions on that task.
Oh. 15
So-
possible questions?
Oh, we'll get one
Hmm.
out of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On our
On
test.
power supplies, there's, how many? Is it
It says up 15.
15?
D-
Okay. I didn't remember it being that many. You only get one of
Oh,
Right, E7, D15.
just don't know which one.
them. You just don't know which one. Well, it didn't take as long that time.
he was
Oh.
right.
And I forgot to stop.